Mastery over life. The spiritual flame. There is inherent in the void of space itself, and in all apparently inconscient matter, a spirit of all-encompassing light and wisdom, hidden there, gradually emerging, eventually to reveal itself as the Godhead. The unfoldment of the Spirit through successive stages of space, matter, animal, man, and God is the very purpose of life. If existence were only just a matter of chance, then sooner or later it would have become chaos. If it were merely a matter of the mechanistic working of blind forces, there could have been no progress, no evolution. The emergence of consciousness out of the inconscient, of supraconsciousness out of the conscious, can only mean that every step of the way is in the hands of a supramental being who, on the planes of matter, is slowly but surely manifesting his entire nature and complete awareness. God is, and he is in all, and even though hidden, yet controls all, and each thing exists only through him, and for a purpose that he alone fathoms, and each thing is in essence himself, and has no existence outside him. Life, then, is not for the sake of man, but for God. Man himself is only an illusion that God has donned in the play of expression he is engaging in, while revealing his nature. Man is a particular stage in the unfoldment of God consciousness, a stage that has transcended the inconscient, but is yet short of exceeding the limits of matter, and consequently has not arrived at that superconsciousness which reveals the ultimate mental and spiritual being. Nevertheless, it is God who is man, God in man who is conscious, who calls himself who is bound by an illusion of his own making, who through the sheer delight of becoming has involved himself in matter, and now through that same delight seeks liberation from it. Thus it is you yourself who are God, not in physical being, not in the limited sense of ego or conscious knowledge or acquired skills, but in spiritual essence, in sheer being, for in the depths of your soul, on another plane of existence, a flame of being burns, no bigger than the tip of the thumb, and you are it, and it is you, and both are God. Man's dilemma, then, is caused by his newly won self-consciousness, his apparent separation from other beings and the world around him. He sees events and people as existing outside himself, as possessing a primary physical reality that acts upon him and which he may act upon. He feels that a force outside him is either something to be confronted or acceded to, that he too may generate a force that either must be confronted or acceded to, and so he sets his physical being and egoistic sense of self to acting upon and reacting to things around him. Thus, it is that more often than not he opposes his ego will to the will of God and suffers pain and defeat. This is his present evolutionary delusion. This is his fall from grace. The dual way. The way to mastery is first to acknowledge the will of God as the supreme working in the world. Once this very primary spiritual decision is made, a man no longer seeks to oppose his ego will against events or people, but rather seeks through expanding his consciousness to penetrate and understand them. Soon he sees God there, intuitively perceives the divine purpose, makes his will one with divine will, and thus rids himself of suffering, pain, and defeat. The simple acknowledgement of the will of God as the supreme working is not the whole course to mastery, however. There are those people, and many of them are sincere seekers, who have so thoroughly immersed themselves in humility that it has become a kind of second ego, and they cannot break out of its limitations or expand into the light of supramental power and action because they have imprisoned their growth in abasement. Complete death of the individual in a swallowing up by the infinite does not produce mastery. Mastery must be exhibited, must effectuate itself, must work in the world, not simply in some hidden realm of the spirit, otherwise it is not mastery at all, but only isolated spiritual ecstasy, and thus still bound to the ego. The individual must surrender himself to the divine true, must actually immerse himself in the vastness of the divine being, but at the same time, he must also expand until he is able actually to sense the divine as being contained within him. Spiritual growth takes two directions: into the divine as a matter of penetration, the object of which is to feel, to sense, to achieve identity, and outward as a matter of expansion, so as to be able to contain the divine, and thus to know, to do, to effectuate. One type of growth without the other produces half illumination. Only both produce mastery. Steps to mastery. It is by becoming aware of the existence of God that we seek Him, and it is by seeking him that we embark upon the road to spiritual illumination. Thus, the first step to mastery is consecration, a total focusing of our intent and energies on uncovering the Godhead, on knowing him. When we seek him, then sooner or later we must find him, but only if we first surrender our egoistic will and seek to follow his intent in all things. Thus, we learn to live in accordance with a greater plan, a more heavenly consciousness, and we inevitably grow senses attuned to the voices of the Spirit. Thus, the second step to mastery is surrender. We live in a world of competition and clash, reward and defeat, pain and pleasure, and the great temptation always before us that we think all thoughts, have all feelings, perform all acts out of egoistic desire. Desire for the fruits of our actions, for the applause of our fellows, the gains of our endeavor, must be exorcised ruthlessly from our nature, for desire keeps us bound to the ego, erects insurmountable walls around the consciousness, makes it impossible to grow. We overcome desire by offering our thoughts, our feelings, our actions to the divine, giving all to him without attachment to result. This is sacrifice performed upon the altar of the ego, that we might more clearly see God. We must perform it daily, even hourly, for sacrifice is the third step to mastery. Then and only then, these three steps taken, will the face of the divine be revealed to us, and we perceive him in all his power and glory, and we see our umbilical attachment to all created things. Then we love, and in that love we are fused with him, and the light of his consciousness bears us upwards onto new planes of being, new effectiveness in living, for love is the fourth step to mastery. These are the steps to mastery over life: consecration, surrender, sacrifice, and love. He who takes them with his heart and performs each as a living sacrament will find his entire being transformed, will awaken the sleeping soul of humanity with his magnificent illustration of the divine life. The life divine. The end of mastery is the divine life, an earthly existence lived in fullness, joy, and complete effectiveness. There is inherent in our natures a perfect being whose purpose is to unveil himself in space and time. Insofar as we allow him to totally possess us, that far his image shines through. And possess us he will in any case, use us he will in any case, but when we identify ourselves with ego and surface mind, his being is obscured, and we struggle in the grip of forces we neither control nor understand. It is only by living through God that our lives take on significance. If we live in the ego, we live for an ephemeral, mortal thing, and we are saddened and frustrated. The divine life is not simply a spiritual realization that transforms a man's inner world and leaves the outer unchanged. Such realization would have but the barest meaning. Spiritual illumination that has not the power to effectively change the world is not true illumination at all, but only a kind of emotional and intellectual sham, a delusion of the ego still, and worse, one that chooses death instead of life. The enlightened man, by special deputation of the divine, is granted the power to act directly upon things through the power of his consciousness, not through being opposed to them, but through being one-souled with them. Through this mystical superseding of the boundaries of consciousness, what he perceives is what each thing perceives, and his will and that thing's will are the same. Purification. It is not into blown-up ego that the enlightened man elevates his consciousness. It is through abandoning ego altogether that he is able to perceive other planes of awareness. It is through a kind of dying, a complete letting go of his individual self and desires, that he truly becomes an instrument of God, and thus eventually is able to transcend the limitations of his earthly self. The will he has always known, desire will, must be let go of altogether, for it is through this will that he often falls into opposition with God's will, and thus experiences suffering and pain and defeat. The divine purifies each instrument by threshing it in its individuality, by exposing it to the fires and elements of existence, then accepting it home again, expanded now, cleansed of its false sense of self, a worthy instrument for his own being. This is the purpose of life. To be, to become, to bring into being, these are the surging forces that underlie all nature, that provide motivating force for everything that is done, everything that exists, every form of life. The great and awesome work that is going on in the universe is not under the plan and supervision of men, but of God. It is he in them who builds and conquers and explores and aspires. It is he in them whose sure hand can be seen bringing all things under dominion, removing inexorably the veil from space and time and cause. The great commandment of life is to be used, and we are only truly used when we offer ourselves as a living sacrifice to him to do with as he sees fit, without tears or pleas, without anguish or remorse, but with joy and fulfillment. Let us then be what we truly are. Become that which we are capable of becoming. Bring into being that which we are capable of envisaging, all at the behest and under the will of God. Let us surrender ourselves to him to be completely used in the fire that is life, so that in the end the spirit may be fulfilled and proceed to its destiny, unencumbered by fear or frustration or remorse. The transcendent goal. To truly become ourselves is the thing to be done, and our true self exceeds the outer body and surface mind. If we salve the wounds and hurts of the ego, strive to understand its gropings and desires and hates, in the end we understand nothing, have appeased nothing, have dealt with nothing, for the ego never truly exists, but is only an infinitely changing mask behind which is hidden the one eternal and omnipresent self. It is this self which is our sustenance and our salvation. As long as we are separated from it by giving false reality to the ego, we are prevented from expanding our consciousness into universal mind, into God-being, into cosmic awareness. But that very instant that we put aside personal desire and seek only the will of the divine, that moment we irrevocably have placed our feet on the path to illumination. And the goals to be attained through enlightenment transcend all earthly things, have their roots in heaven. But just because they concern the root matters of existence, so they affect all material things. And the final proof that the spirit has undergone transfiguration lies in its works in the world. Any other claim to mastery is false. Spiritual illumination that deals with the spirit only and does not free it from its bondage to material existence is meaningless. Spirit is involved in matter for the purpose of rising above it, to become free of pain and defeat and death and decay. This redemption gives life its significance, gives creation a meaning, gives purpose to the eternal seeking of created things for their creator. Directing the consciousness inward and living inward requires an extreme act of decision, a breaking away from the hold of the senses and consequent enamoration with the incessant parade of sensual stimuli. There is no other path to spiritual illumination. Inward the eye of the soul must be turned, there to discern the indwelling God, thus to exceed the limitations of the body and ego in a self-expansion coincident with the measure of the divine. Under no circumstance must this going inward be identified with that painfully introverted egoistic retreat from the world that is the mark of the wounded ego. The introverted ego adds to its psychological illness by becoming preoccupied with the movements and memories of the little dwarf it considers to be itself. The dwarf has not the courage or spiritual resource to abandon self altogether, and thus, through surrender, open up the vistas of a new world. But behind the dwarf, beyond the perception of the ego, exists a supplemental being of light and power and beauty and perfection, whose image we adopt as our own the moment we perceive him. Transfiguration. In Nepal by Kathmandu, near the headwaters of the Ganges, dwelt the blessed Sanjaya. Chosen of God, bearer of the light, knower of the absolute, worker of miracles. A rude hut on the slopes of the Himalayas was his home, exposed to wind and elements, beset by storms in the winter, insignificant on the mountainside, but nestled in the lap of God. Many were Sanjaya's years and far were his travels, and he had dwelt among all manner of men. Europe and Africa had known him, and America and Australia, and the light of his love and his learning he had dispensed at the will of God. There came one day to his mountainside hut a man to whom the truth had been revealed, but whose heart had not accepted it, who had not yet resigned the dominion of the ego, who had not yet surrendered to God. The two men sat cross-legged before a small fire on the earthen floor of the hut, and outside the sinking sun set the mountaintops afire, left the valleys in descending night. This is their dialogue. "There is an ache in my heart," said the seeker, "and a loneliness in my soul. Joy is gone, and hope. Man is swallowed in the unimaginable abyss of space and time, and God does not even know him." Sanjaya moved his hand. "The spirit of man is grown around with flesh, And in order to break through into his true existence, he must grow in two directions: inward into the heart of God, and outward to encompass the being of God. If he grows only outward, he magnifies his ego, and eventually is broken on the wheel of desire. If he grows only inward, he loses himself altogether and is saddened at his weakness. It is there that your progress has been arrested. You have penetrated but not expanded. You have not fully opened your soul. How is it that I have not grown outward? I have sought God with all my heart. Perhaps you have not sought him for his sake, but for yours. Action performed for the sake of desire is action performed for the ego, and if one acts in delusion, one perpetuates delusion. You have carried the false boundaries of the ego self with you, even though you have penetrated the heart of spiritual enlightenment. It is true that I have sought God for the sake of myself, for the sake of my inner peace and strength, but how else can one seek him? One can surrender to him, perform every act for him, think every thought for him. Thus one eventually is led by his will and not by ego will. Thus one eventually expands to include his power and purpose. The seeker felt the anguish of his heart. Then, as he peered out the open door at the darkened slopes of the mountain, something lifted off the shoulders of his soul and passed away into nothingness. He felt joy come over him. Ecstasy seized and possessed him. God has spoken to you, said Sanjaya. It is written on your face. Now the limits of your consciousness are down. Now you are open to receive him. The seeker felt the world recede. Vistas of light and shadow and color opened before him, all hemmed around with sound that was not really sound, but instead a kind of incredible harmony, mathematically perfect, but not cold, rather warm with lovingness and beauty. His innermost heart, long ago disappeared into impenetrable depths, returned to him, energized now with a vitality beyond itself, enlarged with a capacity that included all things. Sanjaya stood and touched him on the brow. A current flowed between them, powerful, relentless, but still compatible and loving, and it seized them and shook them, and they rose above themselves and stood atop the mountain and surveyed the machinery of the universe. And the seeker was awed by what he beheld, and fear began to flood into him, and he would have fled at this return of the ego. But Sanjaya gripped his arm and kept him faced into the countenance of God. You are being threshed now, he said. The chaff is being winnowed from you, so that the pure grain may grow and the ego trouble you no more. Let down the doors of your being and fully allow him to enter. Grow. Not only shall he possess you, but you shall possess him. Peace, power, and perfect action shall be yours. They stood, these two, guru and disciple, on the mountaintop that all aspire to, and as they surrendered to God, so God surrendered to them. And they knew that ecstasy, that indescribable wholeness and joy that comes of union with him. Your spiritual destiny. This evolution out of matter, this unfolding out of flesh of the Godhead in all its glory and power, is not something that must be awaited through further centuries of evolution, but is upon us now, is fully capable of realization now, for the secret and universal self is not gradually entering into his created existences, but is totally existent in the heart of each. God is entirely within you, all his power and presence and wisdom and knowledge. You are not just a part of God. You are altogether God, and God is altogether you. For the purpose of this self-finding did he involve himself in matter, absorb himself in each of his separate existences, and as he evolves and unfolds out of each, so he discovers himself, all aspects of his nature, and this is his delight. This is the salvation of each of us. We have only to let go of absorption with our surface selves, resign the ego and its bondage to desire, and the divine emerges from us, transforms our lives with his presence and power and serenity. A supramental being transcendent of the limitations of the flesh, of space and time, of pain and suffering and defeat and decay, is the purpose of evolution. Gradually the emergence of that being is taking place. Buddha was such a one, as were Moses, Christ, Muhammad. Each time an enlightened man arises from the bondage of ignorance, that much closer is brought the day when mankind shall march by tens of thousands towards spiritual fulfillment. Now your spiritual destiny is upon you. The secret knowledge is yours. The divine in his totality dwells within you. Abandon ego and bondage to your surface self and give over your life to him. He will transform it into an image of power and perfection. You will attain to mastery through becoming one-souled with things, through becoming united with God. 12th meditation. I resign the dominion of the ego and surrender my life to God. I renounce the priority of sensual stimuli and find within my own nature the power to originate thought, feeling, action. No longer do I exist as reflex to events around me, but now I take up that larger existence that descends from higher planes of mind and spirit. I align myself with First Cause. I identify myself with God. I make my life a living sacrifice to him, surrendering each of my thoughts, feelings, and actions without desire for their fruits. No longer am I enamored of the vain desires of the ego. Fame and money and applause are not ends in themselves, and when sought as such are traps from which pain and suffering eventually ensue. I penetrate within myself to that core of consciousness that is pure being. There I take refuge, turning away from all strident demands of the beckoning surface self, yielding my identity to God. Yet I do not lose it. My I remains, is not engulfed, but now takes on greater awareness and eternal significance. I expand outward from the center of myself, beyond all horizons, beyond all limitations, seeking to include that which formerly included me, so that I may know God not only by penetrating him, but also by containing him. Thus I am led to a mystic resolution of myself with the divine, and he and I become one. By special deputation from above, I'm forthwith able to live a divine life upon earth. I seek not to change that which is ordained, but only to understand, to possess identical consciousness with all, and in that identical consciousness to act in accordance with divine will, equal soul to all results, existing always above the conflict, secure in the knowledge of union with God.